Hey gang, today I want to show you a neat little trick that I use in my Buskingshow file to change between different degrees of saturation for my color looks. And I call it the saturation interface, which I think is a pretty cool sounding name for actually a pretty simple idea. So let's hop into MA and I'll show you. I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with those kind of color pickers, and I can choose between different colors for my whole rig in the upper row. But I think that it creates a lot more depth by using different degrees of saturation for different groups of lights. For example, I like to have my spots maybe a little less saturated. So I can do this in this so-called saturation interface by changing from, for example, 100% to 80%. For example, we'll start with the washes. So I have my whole rig grouped into 5 different color groups, which is wash 1, wash 2, spot 1, spot 2, and then I have a spare group, which is actually not used in this show file. And in the color picker, I have arranged it vertically, and in those rows here, I have arranged them horizontally. So, but it's always the same 5 groups of lights. And let's start with wash 1. So if I want my wash 1 group, which is the washers in the roof, I want them to be less saturated, then I can change from 100% to 80%, and I'll show you in capture so you can see it a little bit better. So that's 100% saturation. And now we're going to 80%. And now we're going to 60% and back to 100%. So I choose to use just 3 different cues, and I can do this with the washers on the floor as well. It's a little bit easier to see. That's 60% and back to 100. Can do it with my roof spots. That's 80%. That's 60%. And that's 100%. So most of the time I like my washers to be at 60% for the roof and for the floor washer spots. Sorry, for the spots. Right. So, and then I can just create different colored looks by changing to a different color, but the saturation of it always stays the same. I hope the idea is clear. Now I want to show you how I achieve it. And as I said, it's actually pretty simple, but we'll still do it step by step. So in this tutorial, I will show you how I do a saturation interface. It's actually just an executor with 3 cues. So I'll show you how to do those saturation cues for my spots. First, let's select them all and let's build a preset. And I'm using a special saturation preset for this because in case of the spots which have a CMY color mixing engine, I will use, let's call this preset, then you'll see. It's just RG and B at 100. So that basically means that the fixture is completely, all the color flags are completely open. But for example, when I have a fixture with a additive color mixing unit, then I might go for just the white channel for this saturation preset. So that's the reason why I'm not using my main white preset, but I'm using a different special preset for those saturation things. But as you can see, it's already stored in here. So RGB at 100, which means the fixture is just full white. And now I call this preset and store it to an executor with a fader. That's important. We need a fader. And now we can clear out and have a look on what this executor does. And you can see by activating the executor and just bringing the fader up at 3%, it's snapping to full on and to the full white. So we changed that in the assign options by changing the function of the fader to being a temp fader, which actually means that we can not only scale the intensity of the cue, but all the attributes of the cue with regards to the position of the fader. Hope that makes sense. So as you can see, when I'm bringing the fader up and down, it smoothly fades in and out the white. So that's actually all I'm doing here. Now back to the assign menu. It's very important to assign this on a high priority or maybe even on a super priority. That's always a little bit risky when you're doing things in the programmer which are also overwritten by those executors. So you just have to be very aware of when you are using super priority and when not. So I try to stick with the high priority, but that's really important because otherwise the saturation cue would be overwritten by changing a different color in my color picker, which is obviously not what I want. Perfect. So that's all we need to do here. And then we need a dummy executor with 3 different cues. And that's a technique that I use pretty often in my Buskingshows file. So a dummy executor basically is just an executor with some cues in it, which actually haven't stored any fixture values. So there are no real values stored into those cues, but I only use the command feature that we can use, right? So let's store an executor with 3 cues. Shortcut is store 1 through 3. Well, that's a hard line for a German to say. 1 through 3, and we'll store it to an empty executor, right? So now we got this executor with 3 cues in it, and let's look into the cue list. And as I said, now we will make use of the command line. First, let's label our saturation cue, and I will call this spot set. Cool. So that's controlling the saturation of my spots. And now I can reference this name in the command line. So the command I'll use for this is exec and then an asterisk, which stands for whatever page the executor is on, it'll work. Dot, and then in parentheses, the name of the executor, which is spot set at 0 time 2. So that actually means that the executor goes to 0 in a fade time of 2. And well, let's just copy and paste this. In the second cue, I'll make it 20, and in the third cue, I'll make it 40. But of course, you can change those values and also the amount of cues that you want to have, however you like. Okay, now let's give those cues a name. That's 100% saturation. 80 and 60. So you can see that we're actually, with fader, we're actually not controlling the saturation, but we're controlling how much white we are adding to the actual color. So that means that for a saturation of 100, we need the temp fader or the saturation executor being at 0, right? And for a saturation of 80%, we're fading in 20% of the white. And for 60%, we're fading in 40% white. Hope that makes somewhat sense. Let's see if it's already working. Right, so when we are at 100%, the temp fader is down at 0. And when we go to 80, the temp fader goes to 20. And in the third queue, we go to 60. Oh, by the way, make sure to make the wrap around feature enabled in the assign menu, so that you can always wrap around between those 3 different queues. Let's label it to be saturation, right? So have a look at capture. That's the way how you can achieve different degrees of saturation for your color looks very easily with a temp fader and with a dummy executor. So when I started building my show file, I used another method to achieve this, and it was by having different groups of presets for the different degrees of saturation, which also worked, but it has a big disadvantage for me, which is always when you're like store merging different presets to achieve different looks, you can't have any fade time to that. So that's the big advantage of doing it this way, because I want my busking shows to be very naturally looking, and I don't want them to look like an actual busking show where all the time some things are flashing, but I want it to look really organically, and I want it to look fluidly, and I think I can achieve it with those saturation cues, or with the so-called saturation interface. So hope that helps you out. If you like the video, feel free to subscribe to my channel, leave me a like, and see you next time.